Good. Hey, welcome everyone also online. I hope you can hear me. Yeah? We're good. No surprises. Okay, so I've been asked by Patricia to talk a little bit about how we got to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And it's a very peculiar time to talk about them because, as I will try to show you in my slides today, they're all based on the idea of collaboration. We need to collaborate. And then maybe you read the news this morning, there was some bombs falling on Kiev, and you might wonder, like, how does that go together, right? So on the one hand, we have all these big problems, say we should collaborate on them, and then we have a war going on. Actually, we have more than 100 wars going on the planet, probably you know that, but we never talk about those other ones. But we have also a major one in Europe. So it's a weird time to talk about collaboration and the SDGs, because you might say they are sort of a fairy tale framework. They tell us we can achieve all those things, 17 goals. We can eradicate poverty. Right, we can also make sure that you got decent jobs and payment when you go and work. We also want to solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and a lot of other things. And we're all going to do that in the next 8 years, because this is a framework until 2030. Do you think that can be done? No. Okay. You're realistic. No, it can't be done. Okay, good. And a lot of people agree. They say it cannot be done because look outside, the world is just, it's just very difficult to get those things done. But there are other people, and I will try to be one of those today, that say, look, it is difficult, but if we all pull together and we sort of pool our resources that we have, the skills that we have, the different interests we have, the different experiences that we have across different backgrounds and so on, which includes what you study and what you want to do in life. If we can do that, then there's a chance that we can achieve those goals. Good. And if you're not convinced of that, that's fine. I hope to do that in the rest of the 45 minutes. Good. First of all, can you tell me, why do we have these SDGs actually in the first place? I mean, who came up with them and why do we have them? Yeah. So the United Nations is an international organization where all countries are part of, 196 or something like that. And they usually sit around in New York and they discuss all sorts of stuff. But why was it necessary to have those SDGs? What problem do they try to address? Very good. So it's not one problem they try to address, right? It's not just about climate change or not just about equality or decent work or whatever. So it's multiple problems. All right. And why would you do that in one framework? Right. And that is in a way already the answer to my question. So why would you have this big framework? We come to that 17 goals. There's a lot of indicators, 200, I don't know what indicators, a lot of sub-sentences. And why would you do that? And one answer is, because everything hangs together in a way, right? And you want to make sure that not everyone is just pulling off in one direction, trying to fix those problems in one way, and others in another. Good. So I will talk a little bit about that, the background, why we have this SDG framework, and then I'll talk a little bit about one of the really specific things about it. And I mentioned that in the beginning. The whole idea is that everyone works together. And again, you might say that sounds like it's a fairy tale, so no one works together all the time. It's always difficult, and that's true. So I will talk a little bit about how we could do that, how we could make sure that we work together on those issues. And that I think is important for your background as well, because you might say, I want to become a software engineer, or work in IT, or develop artificial intelligence, whatever you want to do. That's all great. So why would I care about any of that? And one answer is we need people like you, because as I said, it is a collaborative effort, right? And if we waste the skills of a whole sector, then that's bad. Just a little side note. I read a fascinating article recently about bullshit jobs. You know what bullshit jobs are? Can you explain what a bullshit job is? So, actually, I agree, good book. The guy unfortunately died 2 years ago. Greba is his name. Anyway, but interesting book. Now, the key idea being that there's a lot of work done that's not meaningful. How does it relate to my topic? Well, one of the examples I read on Twitter was actually someone saying, imagine all these people working at Facebook or Instagram, and they try to make other people click so that they can buy some stuff that we all know will wreck up the planet. And then people like me need to fix it. That doesn't make sense. Why can't we use the ingenuity of people who know how to manipulate Facebook for something good? And I know that's naive again, you might say, right? But that's a bit why I think it's good for you to hear about that stuff, because you have a choice. You have a choice what you want to do with the skills you learn in university, right? Everyone has that. We do, we go somewhere, we make decisions, right? But that's important to know what choices you have. And one of them is maybe to take a bullshit job. I'm not saying what that is. I'm not saying that's per se at Facebook. That's what the guy on Twitter said, but I mean, it's an interesting idea. But there's also the option to engage in something meaningful. It may be more difficult. That is, for example, collaborating with other people that have different mindsets, but it becomes really difficult to solve complex problems. problems. And that's what I want to talk about today a little bit, if I manage. Okay, now let's get started. 17 goals, super complex. Basically, if you look at them, it seems like they were just throwing in stuff, right? A lot of things in here that maybe you wouldn't put together in a list. So why do we have 17 and not 16, 18, or 5? And there's only one reason for that. Can you guess that? So the reason is it's a political compromise. Because there's no scientific reason that someone said these are the 17 things we need to do. There might be more, might be less, I don't know. But it's basically when people come together, politicians, and they negotiate. So someone says, I want poverty in, because I'm from a country where we still have a lot of poor people. And then someone from the Netherlands says, yeah, but we, going to do something climate change because all the youth on the street and they get a bit nervous. So we put something in there. Say, okay, let's do both. So it's actually a political negotiation, a compromise in the end, right? So there's no logic to that in the sense that you would say it's, scientifically proven that that's the 17 things we should do. I don't say they're totally bogus, but I say they are not necessarily there for any really strict scientific reason. They're there because they represent a compromise. Actually, if you look at them, so we have, for example, poverty, zero hunger, but we also have stuff like industry, innovation, decent work and economic growth, life below water, life on land. Can you maybe just briefly try to organize them in a way? What do you think they include in terms of different areas or interests? Or if I would ask you to cluster them maybe briefly. If I had longer time, I would actually ask you to do that really and sit together and do that. But I can't do that today. So just help me out really quickly. Can you see any way to organize them? And maybe you have seen that already. There are tons of those figures on the internet where people did that. Anything that strikes you as belonging together? If you look at it, it seems there's a whole bunch of stuff that might be interesting for the Netherlands of the world. And there's a whole bunch of things in there that might be interesting for a country like Bangladesh. And the reason why they're all in there together is because that is the type of compromise you would have to do at the UN, right? Where some countries might say poverty is really important. We don't really care about, life on land, whatever that is for you, right? Good. And then there's some really weird stuff. 16 and 17 are not about any concrete problem. They talk about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And 17, partnerships for the goals. That might be a bit surprising, but that's basically the cooking recipe. That tells you how we're going to achieve them, okay? And that's really important. Think about the war in the Ukraine, because what that says is, well, first of all, we need peace and justice to achieve any of those things, 16, and 17 talks about a spirit of partnership. And that's why I say sometimes it's a bit difficult to discuss that stuff at this present moment, but it's really important because it has the important ingredients to succeed. Okay, good. So if you all know that, then it can be really short. So UN negotiated that over a couple of years, and in 2015, they decided that the SDGs are just the way we measure it. What it actually is called the 2030 Agenda, which is basically the idea that until 2030, solve all sorts of problems, and the SDGs are the way to measure that and to do that, okay? Make sense? Good. So they're like a tool. Now, you already might see the problem. In 2015 was 15 years. That sounds like a long time. It's already 2020, so actually that's not that long anymore. So we're moving already in the phase where people go like, what should we do afterwards? Say, huh? What? We solved all the problems, we're done. No, that's not how that works, right? In international politics, you always continue, right? So they're already now talking about the next iteration of that. And as you said, we're probably not going to achieve them, but it doesn't mean we should stop trying, right? So there will be probably some sort of SDG 2, which comes afterwards. So this is a voluntary framework. I always say everything is voluntary. I mean, probably you crossed the red light this morning on the way here. It's actually strictly forbidden to do that, right? So following the law is voluntary. The thing that you actually do then is you accept the consequences, right? That's what you do. So that's voluntary, but you say, is there anything would get countries actually to do what they say? Because for an individual negotiator, politician, maybe in a democratic system where after 4 years you're out of government, what's the point, right? Good. And that's a really important thought, because the way the SDG framework is built tries to answer to that challenge. And actually, that's what I will talk about today. Because if you say, look, we cannot trust one partner, one actor, what do? You diversify, right? So maybe you have seen that, maybe not. When you walk on to the main building, which is this one of our main Hoofdgebouw, and you come in from both sides. Have you done that this morning, maybe? Do you know what I mean? You see the little tiles on the floor, which are the 17 SDGs on both sides. We have them very new. We have them for a couple of weeks. So why would a university put the SDGs from the main building? And maybe you saw we also have the flag up. We have 3 flags up. It's an LGBTQ plus flag, there's a food flag, and an SDG flag. Now, why would we do that? Okay, raise awareness. Yeah, very good. Could be good publicity too, right? Looks nice. But essentially, that's one answer to your question, because if some actors just talk and don't do what they need to do, maybe other actors can come in and take some of that slack. And I'm not saying that's necessarily what's happening, but that could be one idea. Okay, yeah. Good. And in fact, I think that's a good example, because the university and many universities around the world, in the Netherlands, everyone has SDGs on their website. Just check it. I mean, everyone's saying, yeah, we work on the SDGs. Partially, yeah, that's window dressing. But that already tells you something about the voluntariness, right? If everyone says, oh, that's something important, yeah, they might not really do what they ask to do, but they accept that it is important in a way, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't talk about it at all. Good. But this is a really good question. We come back to that. So just very quickly, probably we'll discuss that as well. These are 2 very stylized ways to think about what sustainability or sustainable development, I will explain the difference in a second, is. And I want to just know if you can tell me the difference, because it matters a bit how you use that concept, right? When I say the SDGs are about getting us into a more sustainable future, trying to address the sustainability problem and what I'm actually talking about. And these are 2 ways to look at that. Can you just explain what you see to me and tell me maybe why they're different? Also online is possible if you want to join. Okay. Anyone? It's super simple, right there. Just need to describe what you see. So I remember that from school in math when we talked about, the theory of groups. I was confused. Does the groups of groups contain the groups of groups? Yeah. Okay. But you're good, because that one is really different. What central aspect? You say this is about trade-offs or about overlaps. You can say the sweet spot is right here when everything comes together. And here, what's the message here? So it's basically a hierarchy, you could say, and then some people say it all starts with the economy and then it branches out. I think that's not how that is meant to be, but that's a different thing. Probably means that everything rests within the structural parameters of the Earth system, right? Because those parameters basically dictate what we need to do. They are the constraints that we have. So in them, you have society, and society has many things they do. One of them is economy, but there are other things that we do in society, right? Good. And they're very different in a sense, because this one would start with saying there's something really important you take care of, so the integrity of the Earth system, and then you can do the other stuff. Whereas this would say probably these are equally important ways of doing stuff, of thinking, of pursuing whatever you pursue. Okay. And which one do you think is more important today in our debates about sustainability and the SDGs? The left one, yeah. And why would you say that? But what makes it maybe more appropriate? So it also, I think, looks like there's something about giving and taking. Everyone is sort of right in there together. So it doesn't exclude any specific view from the outside. Because this one, if you're an economist, you would say, why am we here? They don't like that anyway. They say, oh, yeah, everything is economy, right? So then you would have that debate. And this it doesn't do that. It says there are these equal things. Good, keep that in mind, because that's an important influence to the SDG process. The SDG process is in fact based on this model and not on that model. Good. Okay, very quickly, there are lots of definitions of what sustainability is, and please don't read them all. They're just here, and there are hundreds literally. That it's not about exactly what it is. There's no way to define that. It's not a natural sort of quark, or even you couldn't define a quark necessarily. You can just measure it. But anyway, this is just what people make of it. Yeah, you define it, and someone else has a different definition. It makes it a bit fuzzy. Okay. So, but you can disagree about central elements of it. But most of it converges around this idea that you need to take care that you can continue doing what you do, either because future generations want to enjoy the planet, or simply because we need to make sure we don't disrupt the basic systems that sustain us. Okay, good. it says sustainability. Now, the SDGs are the Sustainable Development Goals. So what is development then if I add it to sustainability? Sounds a bit like a contradiction to me, or maybe not. What is sustainable development? How we would improve ourselves as a society or global society, yes, okay. And why is that necessary? I feel very developed this morning, you know, very smart. You look very smart, very developed. So why is that actually something we need to do? Why do we need to develop something? What's the idea behind that? Huh? But why isn't everything already developed? Yeah, okay, that's a good one. So we're not done, and maybe we will never be done, right? So development is the idea that you have an inner potential as a person, as a society, as a group of people, and you want to get there, but there are certain obstacles, and so you need to unpack that.
Isn't that intrinsic in human nature to evolve?
Yeah, probably. That's right. So that's why it's a very uncontested concept that we develop. You know, it's also when you think about concepts like growth, and most people understand that as a natural thing. It's like, yeah, that's how we always grow. But actually, that's not true, right? Life is a curve. So anyway, good. But that's maybe for a different lecture. So sustainable development tries to say we want to have this potential, either of individuals or societies, to get somewhere where we're not yet. And whatever that is debated, right? Fair society, equitable society, everyone super rich, whatever, everyone educated, all different things. But basically we want to develop, and we want to make sure we can actually do that, so we can sustain that type of development, okay? So we want to make sure that we can actually develop now and in the future. And one really good definition is that one. It's also political because it was developed by experts, so it's not a purely scientific definition in that sense. And it says sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. And that's a really interesting one because it brings in that really difficult problem that I'm 47, so I will most likely statistically be here a bit, shorter than you are, which means I have less problems, for example, from climate change, because that will kick in a bit later. So that's your problem. But it's even the bigger problem for my kids who are small. And what about those kids that are not born yet, right? So that's the idea that needs to be taken into account. And why that is the case, a lot of really good philosophical debates, whether you actually have a sort of responsibility for any future generations and so on and so on. But that was the basic idea. We want to make sure we can keep on developing. So we need to make sure that future generations have the same ability to do that. Now, fundamentally, the problem is if we use all the stuff here and we leave an empty room, that doesn't seem like they could then develop, right? So that's the key problem. We need to leave something behind, some inheritance behind that makes it possible for future generations to develop. Okay, now all of this is a long debate, 50 years basically, as you can see here, because we are discussing that at the UN since 1972. That's actually exactly 50 years. We had an anniversary conference in Stockholm this summer, the Stockholm Plus 50, which marks half a century of politicians discussing the need to take care of the environment and develop human societies. So you might say, wow, that's a long discussion and not necessarily super successful, because most scientists, if you follow that discussion, say we're really getting into problems now. Climate change is accelerating, right? We have a huge biodiversity extinction event. We have really big inequality problems on the planet, So the richest 1% of people have roughly 45% of all the emissions. That doesn't sound really fair. Good. And they all want to go to Mars and leave us here, but that's a different story. So 50 years of negotiating that seems like a long time. So the SDGs actually coming quite late in this process. So remember that. This is not a new thing in 2015 that said, oh, we need sustainable development, right? And then we have these SDGs. It's actually following up on a long discussion. But the SDGs are really different also in a couple of aspects, and I will come to them in a second. Good. So this is a fascinating story in itself. I'm not going to go there, but please remember a lot of attention has been put on those issues. So it's not that no one actually talks about it, right? So you could say, oh, there's this big problem and no one ever thought about it. No, that's not true. They talk about it all the time. So it's rather like you say, they talk about it, make these agreements, but they don't really follow up. Good. Actually, maybe one thing I should have mentioned, but you know that probably already. So the SDGs, for whom are they actually, who do they target? Who's the addressee of the SDGs? Everyone. Yeah. Oh, you, me, everyone, right? Other ideas? Actually, so governments, and then you say everyone. Both is true. First of all, therefore, all governments, which is really important, because you could say, well, not everyone has the same problems, right? Think about it. Right? So the Netherlands has all these SDGs, and they need to actually work on all of them. You say, why? They're really good, but it depends on how you look at it, right? So we're good in some of those, but not so good in others. So it's for everyone, all countries. But you're right, it's not only for governments. Actually, it says so in the negotiated text. It says it's actually a framework for the whole of society. And that's what's called the whole of society approach. Good. So that's also why the university is actually not doing something super rare, super weird out there. They're actually just following up basically with that discourse that we have, that everyone needs to come on board. All right. So far, so clear? No? Good. Okay, so nothing surprising. So just one intervention here. Despite this 50 years of talk, it's not going very well with most of the indicators that we actually use to measure the SDGs. So some colleagues have just finished a 7-year assessment of the first half of the SDGs, and they said it's really not good. Okay, not surprising when you said intuitively in the beginning, so we're not going to reach them, right? So maybe you're not surprised, but it still shows us that not necessarily a lot of traction on achieving them. And why? That's a really fascinating debate. Not going to go in that too much. Good, but just keep in mind, there are these interrelated problems, you know, climate change, biodiversity, how we use energy, but also equity and poverty and human health issues. They're all related and they're all very complex. So many observers said, we need something new, a cool idea, something that would be different than, you know, how we did it for the last 50 years. And so they started to discuss an approach that I will focus now a little bit on, which is actually enshrined in the SDG 17. And that's this idea that we sort of need to collaborate. We need to collaborate between countries. Yeah, that's not so surprising. It's very difficult, by the way, right? But we need to do that because we have this north-south element in there. But we also need to collaborate between different parts of society. And that's a very simple, stylized way how you can think about a society. To say, well, there's, you know, civil part, which is probably where we don't use money, but other exchanges. So when you care for your kids, you don't say, you need to pay me. Maybe some do that, but you don't. Okay, so you do part of that stuff or care for your parents without being a monetary transaction, right? But you organize also other things in that sort of civil society realm. You might organize a book club. You might be part of a choir that's saying all of this is sort of not really the market. No one pays for that, right? You do it voluntarily. It's also not part of the government. Good. Then we have the government, which is the people who make decisions that we all need to follow. So collective decisions, basically the idea being they're all in our common interest, right? But the idea is that a government can actually make decisions that affect you. And then the market is this realm where we have transactions mediated by money, usually, right? Or price mechanism. It's a derivative of that. And basically means that the market is where you can trade and sell. Can be ideas, can be products, can be services, right? Can be influence, can be anything. And all of those things make up society. And probably more things make up society. Well, that's the sort of idea. And what happens, you might recognize the similarity in that one and the SDG diagram that I showed you in the beginning, that overlaps, is that if you bring them together, those different perspectives, then you can achieve something that is more than the sum of the individual parts. So yeah, government can make rules, and they do that all the time. But I mentioned already my traffic light example. Why is it that in Amsterdam, no cyclist really stops at a red light? Ever thought about that? Because in other countries, they do that. And don't answer because that's not, I mean, an interesting discussion itself. But it seems that the government can make rules, but it doesn't make sure they actually succeed. You could say it's not clever. Okay, good. So then you say, look, what you could do is you could ask those people who actually cycle to come up with a solution. Or you could say maybe actually it is in this case it's maybe not, but you could say maybe it's something that the market can help with, that you actually try to just figure out the most efficient way to solve that problem. And then when you do that, you come into some realm of probably experimentation, which is where you don't really know what's happening, but you come up with a good solution. Okay, good. Give you one example. When you go to Central Station, here Centraalstation in Amsterdam, and you have the back end at the eye, you want to go to the ferries to Noord. There's a space where the roads intersect. You know that, some of you? And it's really weird because the cyclist path comes this way. The road comes that way. The taxis go that way. And then the ferries are that way with all the people embarking. And there's no rule who has the right of passage. And that's purposefully because they said, well, if we take away all of that, everyone will be confused and actually try to figure out what's going on. So you're actually much more careful. And that's very clever because that was developed in an experiment there where they tried different ways to do it. And that was done not just by the city council, but actually in collaboration with some of the users. This is a good example. So when you do that, it might be a bit messy, but it sometimes gives this surprising results. If you go there, be careful. You can still be run over. Okay, so usually this is referred to as various things, a multi-stakeholder approach, a public-private partnership you sometimes hear, or in general, I like that most, a collaborative approach, a collaborative initiative, okay? And why do I say that? Because when they came together, the governments in New York in 2015, and they were discussing all the problems that we have, and then they came to the very end and said, so how are we gonna address those problems? And they said, we need a certain new spirit, something that sort of, takes us away of this 50 years of negotiations I mentioned into a new, sort of more innovative era. And they said, so we're gonna write that down as an SDG in itself. And it's the SDG 17, which talks about a partnership for sustainable development. And what is meant by that is that actually this should be the model, how we achieve that. Okay. Now there's also a formal definition. I don't want to bore you with that, but that's one definition of that. But let us think just a little bit about what are the benefits of doing it that way. Can you help me? So we have 17 SDGs ranging from really totally different things, from poverty to saving the oceans, basically. And then the way we're going to do that is collaboration, which also means that we need all types of knowledge, all types of skills sort of together. And I just want to hear from you now why that is good, and then we do why it's bad. Let's do good first. So why do you think that's a good idea? What are the sort of benefits you would get from that type of model? So usually the way we teach you is we start as a discipline. We teach you, you're this, and yeah, that's what I am. And you build your identity, and you believe all this internal stuff that we teach you there. And then at one point you meet someone else, and that person tells you it's all wrong because what I study says something totally different. Just give you an example. So I have a lot of economists in my institute where I work, and they all make these models of, how the world looks like and prices, what the effects are of different things like climate change, for example. And the one thing all the models have in common is that they basically think that we can continue forever with our economy, right? You know that? It's a certain nice idea. It's called growth. Now, there was a paper published recently in, I believe, Nature. It's super funny because a couple of physicists, they just said, well, if that's true, we will calculate basically how long we can do that physically. And what they did is they took the growth rate in terms of our energy use, that's 2.9% per year, and they extrapolated that in the future. So they asked, at what point will we exceed the energy of the sun that we would need? And you might intuitively say that's like long in the future, right? How long is it actually in the future? Until we, at that growth rate, which, every 100 years doubles in intensity, how long will it take to exceed all the energy that's produced by fusion in the sun? And the answer is, it's only 1,200 years. You must say, that's really long. Well, not really. That's when we built big cathedrals in Europe. And 2,000 years ago, you can still go and go to Rome and stand in the Colosseum. That's 2,000 years ago. Actually, 2,000 years from now on, roughly, we'll have exceeded all the energy in the galaxy. So if anyone tells you, yeah, we can just continue doing that. No, you can't. Okay, you can. It doesn't matter what technology you have, by the way, because there's a thermodynamic boundary, right? I mean, you can only, if you have the energy produced that the sun produces on Earth, Earth is smaller, it gets hotter than the sun. Even Elon Musk cannot get us out of that. Okay, non-possible. Good. And why do we say that? That's one thing the economists never discuss, because it's part of their discipline. Now, when you bring them in conversation with other people, like the guys that wrote that Nature paper, something interesting happens. Because then people start to say, oh, that's interesting. So maybe we need to change something here. And when we do that, of course, what they just found out also changes, right? That's not a given, because those things interact. Depends on how you tweak the parameters. That's a good example of how you in science need to collaborate. And that's why we actually put a lot of money in people that have different trainings, need to unlearn their training and try to discuss how you can work together in an interdisciplinary setting. Good, now that's one example why that's good. What else is good about this approach? So diverse perspectives, what else?
You can share like specialties. I think governments are really good in bureaucratic stuff, but markets are really efficient. So if you can share it, like maybe you can get like the good.
Very good. So some people are just very good in some stuff. Governments are good in saying, no, you can't do it. Very good. But you already said it at the beginning, that's not necessarily meaning that you always comply. So actually markets can help us to comply. Right? For example, we now have energy prices rising. What happens? People get more efficient in their energy use. They just change behavior, right? So I shower shorter because my energy bill is up. That's basic behavioral change induced by a price mechanism. Very simple. No government, I know they tell you you should shower less, but that's not really a law, right? So actually why I shower less, why I change behavior is because of the price mechanism. So just an example, right? Okay, so that's good. So you can bring in the various expertises of different sectors, perspectives, professions. Good. Yeah.
There is a question.
Oh yeah. Yeah, very good. Go ahead. Okay, so I see that's true, and also shows that this mechanism is difficult because it, takes a while to unlearn those things, what you actually want, but it's powerful in that sense. Okay, so that's 2, maybe 3. What else? Why is that a good idea? Right. We can start to connect stuff, right? So I also mentioned the SDGs, actually 17 boxes. And we have different perspectives. And what you then do is you start to actually see that they're all connected, because you bring in people who tell you that, what I didn't know, for example, I never thought about it, that when you use a computer and it's hooked up to the internet, it actually depends on what I do, it produces lots of emissions, right? Some server has to work somewhere, right? But I never really thought about this because those emissions are not embedded in my computer. They're just somewhere, okay? So, for example, when you Google yourself, for example, how famous am I? What's happening on Instagram? Every time you do that, every time you look up something, there's some emission somewhere, right? You don't see that. But once you know that, so when I thought about it, and someone showed me actually a calculation, so every time you do that operation here, somewhere this gigantic factory of servers will spring an operation. And unless they are really zero emissions, which actually they are not, because if you think about it globally, I mean, just as a fraction, it's very small. Every time you do that, something happens with emissions. But I didn't see them because they don't come out of my computer, right? So, but once you know that, once you have understood that, you cannot go back, right? You will basically have that idea in your mind. Okay, good. Let's looking at the time, go on. There are also people who say this idea is bad. That's not good. Usually every argument has 2 sides. So what's the counter side? Why is that maybe problematic? Sounds like a fairy tale. Very good. So 2030 agenda, 8 years left, and I tell you, hey, we're going to sit together, different disciplines, different professions, different ways of thinking, different countries, different parts of society, and experiment with all sorts of crazy stuff so that we can fix those problems. You're like, yeah, we don't have time for that. So we need the solutions now, right? And that's probably one problem. It seems like a bit luxurious in terms of how much energy you need to put in that to make it work, right? What else could be a problem? I mean, if you all agree it's good, then I sold it. You're like, good. But, come on. So there must be something wrong. Something problem. Yeah. Same for time, but also it's risky. Should you invest intellectual, property, energy in those things, uncertain outcomes? If others have access to that, Why would any private firm collaborate with civil society? Right? It's like, I want to tell Greenpeace what I'm really up to, yeah, says Shell. Okay. So that's a problem. What else? Are you all too positive? Okay, guys. Yeah. So just to give you one example, not really an example. I just want to make a comment about it. I do that. You know what a COP is? The Conference of the Parties to the Climate Agreement. Have you heard about that? So this is a meeting where all the governments come together to negotiate, to discuss what they achieved, and that's every year basically. And this year, actually, really soon in November, it's 27, COP 27, 27th time they meet to discuss climate change, and it will be in Egypt in Sharm el-Sheikh. And guess who is the main sponsor of that event? Close, yeah, it's actually Coca-Cola. And maybe you're like, yeah, that's cool. I mean, good, why not? It's nice. Huh? But if you think about it, Coca-Cola is the biggest plastic polluter on the planet. And of course they say, no, we're not. We just sell you a plastic bottle and you throw it away. That's not our problem, right? Good. Yeah, that's what they do. So exactly, there's maybe a problem in terms of interest, collusion, if you bring them together. So then people say, look, this is not how it looks like. Those actors, the companies, they're on top. They're even more powerful than governments, right? You know what Shell actually did when the Dutch government wanted to tax them? They moved, exactly the same. Bye-bye. We're no longer Dutch Royal Shell. Sorry, we change the name and we're out of here. And the reason why they can do that is because they're relatively powerful, relatively speaking, right? Now, some actors have more difficulties moving. So when you follow the debate about Schiphol, the airport, so you be regulated, too much emissions, and then they say, yeah, but we cannot really move the airport. Right? So that's more difficult. But they still try to make the same arguments. They say, all the people working for us, 40,000 people, you'll have this big unemployment in Amsterdam. Do you want that? Right? So maybe there is a hierarchy in here, and it's not collaboration on the same level, and that's why it's difficult. Okay, that could be a problem. So co-optation, the time, the sunk investments. Anything else? Now, it sounds already like a lot of problems. Good. So like many debates in real life, right, they are a bit balanced. And just to remind you, so this idea of partnerships, nothing I made up, it's actually in SDG 17. And there's lots of text. So I have one of those quotes here. Encourage and promote effective public, private, and civil society partnerships. I think that's 17.8 or something. So that's actually a goal that we should achieve. Okay. Yeah, I mentioned those things already. This is just my list, but keep in mind that, of course, I'm not trying to sell you, the miracle pill or so. That's not what it is. It's just one way that we have actually thought about this in this process that might work. Good. I want to share, to close off, something that might be useful beyond the SDGs, which is a generic framework of how you make collaboration work. And I didn't make that up. I did actually a bit because it's from a paper I wrote, but we looked at 500 papers that were written about stakeholder, multi-stakeholder partnerships, collaboration, all of these kind of things. And we try to distill what the secret recipe is. Okay. So think about it that way. We already discussed that collaboration is good, has a lot of potential. You bring in these different perspectives, you can experiment, you can overcome those sort of interests that are vested, but it's also difficult because it takes a long time. Someone might co-opt, okay? So it's not easy. So what do we know? What works? And I want to just talk really briefly about that. You can think of this as something we could use to make collaboration more effective in the SDG context. But you can also think of it just as a generic reminder of whenever you try to collaborate. For example, we have a student group, it also works very nicely. Good. Okay, so there are 3 blocks. They're basically 3 big Lego blocks we have. One is called, you need to think about who is in, the actors. You need to think about what they do, the process they use. And then there's always a context. Now, logically, what can you control least? The context. So unfortunately, here is usually the stuff that really matters. But if you think about it design-wise, then that also makes sense that you spend a lot of time on those, because if you get them right, you can maybe counterbalance that you can control the context. maybe you can actually control the context, depends. Okay, bless you. So remember again, so we looked at 500 articles and we distilled basically the lessons learned from them. So it's super, how should I say, simplified in that sense, because those were papers empirical on really different things, right? Could be a development partnership in a specific country in Africa. It could be you know, a survey done among people that were actually collaborating and asking what they thought were success conditions. So really, really different inputs, but we distilled it down to those. Okay, leadership. First thing you should remember is you need leadership in a sense of you need a good idea and someone who creates momentum. It doesn't have to be a person, it can be an organization, it can be an idea. Do you know that guy who wants to clean up the ocean? Yeah, can you tell the story briefly? Ocean cleanup. Bon Slat, drop out from university, said, I have an idea, I want to do that. And people are like, you're just a guy. Didn't even study, yeah? I don't know, maybe. So why would you follow? Because I have a good idea. Okay, so he went around, convinced everyone that that's a good idea. And he's out there with these prototypes, cleaning up parts of that Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is the size of France, by the way. So it's a long cleaning. But he's there and he's doing it. And that's not because the government said, hey, we need to clean up the oceans here. No, because there was someone leading with an idea. So he brought on partners, he brought on business investors, he brought on people that were engineers, and I looked at the best technology. It's fascinating. Really great example actually of this approach, because he cannot do all the things himself, right? He's just a linchpin that brings that together. Good. So leadership is important. Who creates momentum, who guides the process, and also who fosters the group cohesion. And that's really important because in any group you have conflicts, right? So you need someone who is smart enough to understand that and to guide the group process. And then there's a lot of theory how you do that, but we're not going to go into it. Okay, so the second thing you need to get right is who is actually part of your collaboration, of your partnership, right? Because ideally, you don't want to sit with the other students that all are super busy because they all play tennis or hockey. You want to have some students in your group that have a lot of time, and you may have some that are super smart and some who can write very well, right? So you need different skills, in other words, to make it work. And that's also true for these type of collaborations. Good. That is partially something you can plan, can go out and seek, but sometimes you're just stuck with what you have. Then leadership becomes even more important. Because how do you lead people that are not hierarchically lower than you? Just with your example, with a good idea, then they will follow, right? This Bon Slat, he didn't have money. He wasn't in government. He wasn't a professor. He was just someone with an idea. So he went around, made that pitch, and people started to believe. That is really important to make that work. Good. And then a couple of smaller things. I can should give you the paper so you can read them. So, for example, inclusiveness also super important in the beginning. When you exclude someone, it often comes back because then people say, "Why aren't they a part?" You say, "Nah." Right? And sort of think about that really good. Who should be part of that? Makes it much easier. Okay, the second box is process, and process is by far the most important. Why is that? Because there things go really wrong. Okay, you can have a great idea, have the right people on board, everyone is super enthusiastic, and then you forget, for example, to make clear how you do things or what you actually want to achieve. I'm working here for almost 20 years in this university. I was really confused sometimes when I try to figure out who actually is in charge and what are we supposed to do. You might say, that's super easy, you just go and teach and write a paper. Right? That's true, but a lot of other things that we need to do, and often it's not clear where they come from. And that's because there are all sorts of deficiencies in many organizations, by the way. That's a different topic. Okay, first thing for the process, goal setting. What we want to achieve, that's really important to have something that everyone agrees on, that's shared, right? So imagine this guy with the ocean cleanup would have one story, which is, I want to go there, clean up the ocean. And then other people in this coalition would say, no, we're actually there to make a lot of money because we can sell the plastic on the market. It's actually both true. That's part of the rationale. But if you don't have one goal, it becomes a bit different. Okay. Makes sense. You need funding. We don't need to go in there, but think about that. Management means you need efficient procedures and help to do stuff. Also makes sense. You want to don't waste too much time on people not knowing what they do. So you need professional people helping, that makes sense. And then really most important, you need to constantly evaluate what you do, monitor, verify, and report on it, right? And that's actually a good strategy for anything you do in life. Self-monitor what you do and try to check it against some goals. Okay? Because if you don't do that, you might think you're going somewhere in life or whatever, you study or whatever you do. But how do you know if you don't assess it? Right? So that's really important. And surprisingly, many of those initiatives that we studied in real life, because they actually should have said that, there more than 7,000 of those partnerships that try to address the SDGs, by the way, globally. Very few of them have a clear idea how they monitor their progress, which is not good. Okay, good. Finally, coming to the context, these are the three last things, and I said already that's difficult to do. Maybe I start with the most important that you cannot really change. That's what is the problem that you try to address? Because there are some problems which are relatively easy to do. Think about it. Example is, on which side of the street do you drive? I mean, in England, they drive on the left, and here we do on the right. And both is fine. The only thing you need to do is you make sure you know which side it is. It's a very simple problem. You just need to decide. Okay? There's nothing really involved in there, but it's just a decision type of thing. But very few problems are like that. Most problems are really complex. There are type of problems, you're in a country, you don't know which country, and you don't know on what side to drive, and you're blind. That's a different type of problem, you see, because then how do you figure that out? Good. So you need to understand what the problem is, because if you don't get the problem right, you don't know what you need to do. Okay? And that goes wrong a lot in those partnerships. They seem to address some problem that isn't really there. So they have a nice procedure, they monitor, they do all this kind of cool stuff we talked about, learn and blah, blah, blah. And in the end, what comes out is really not that effective because it didn't really tackle the problem. Give you one real world example. How do we prevent plastic pollution? Well, I tell you how we not prevent it. By, for example, exchanging the plastic straw in your plastic cup. Now we have plastic cups with a paper straw. And you're like, is that the major problem that we have on the planet? No, it's just purely symbolic. Okay, so it's the wrong solution to the problem. Okay. Final thing I want to say, political and social context matters a lot for your collaboration, because as you said in the beginning, if there's no support, people don't follow up, if politicians go and do something different, it will be really difficult. So what if let's say the UN would decide tomorrow that they stop with the SDGs. Okay, it didn't work, stop. Pull down the flag, get away with the tiles. And then the food would have a choice, or whatever collaboration you're in. You say, we can stop, right? Or we can continue. But of course, if you don't have the support around you, it's much more difficult, right? So it's easier if there's that support. And actually, that's what many people say. The SDGs were never meant to be like a policy, here with a red light where they say you should do that or you shouldn't. No, that was not what they were designed to do. They were designed to create that framework that supports what people would do anyway. Come together, talk about their problems, and find solutions. But because that is now enshrined at the highest level, the international level at the UN, you get a totally different support than if you just sit at home and think, oh, on my street, there's a lot of litter. How do I get rid of that? Yeah, so that is actually probably why the SDGs are important and why they work, is they provide that framework. And so that's what I want to close now. And it doesn't matter what you do, what profession you're in, what you study. The SDGs are in that sense generic, they're for everyone. And they could be useful also for what you do, because they provide a mindset in which you can try to connect problems, try to see how they connect. But you also hopefully learn that you can also use that idea of collaboration to make a contribution to them. And I think that would be nice, because people like you are ultimately very well trained to do that. Because you got all that nice education where we talk about system thinking, teach you that there are other disciplines. So you cannot go and say, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that there are other people around that don't program. I didn't know that. No, you can't do that, because you do know. So we have a lot of hope in that sense, let's say for the future generation, because you're right here. But for a newer generation that doesn't come in with all the blind spots that our generation came in, it actually comes more natural that you have different perspectives and that you see differences better. Good. Good. I know it's a bit hard to do this pitch, you know, in the middle of a war in Europe, but still, I think it's true that actually collaboration is the only way we can actually solve those problems. Because as some of you observed, there is no one who knows the answer to all those. Look, if you would make Patricia the president of the world, she wouldn't know how to fix all these SDGs. Or me neither, no one would. That's the problem. There is no one, no institution, no organization, no country who could say, just let me do it, and then we're all good. No, that's not how it is. So that's why we need you, we need all of us, and we need the spirit of partnership and collaboration, which is enshrined in SDG 17. Thank you for your attention, and maybe we have time for questions. 3 minutes.
Yes, 3 minutes. Question. Okay. Given the time, I think we have to break. Thank
Good.
you very much.
Yeah, thanks to you. Thanks for all your input.